All right, good morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. In just a second after the screen warms up. Today, what we're going to be talking about is asking and answering research questions. Goodness, hold on a second. Just making sure everything is connected. There we go. That's not quite what that's supposed to look like, is it? Right, hold on, everybody. Oh, goodness. All right, well, I don't know what's going on. We really don't need slides for today because we're going to mostly be doing some discussion, doing a little bit of an activity to help us refine our research questions. And if you want to look at the slides I'm using, they'll be available to you up on the Zoom recording after class. Turn that off because it looks silly. Okay, so the plan for today is that we're going to start off by, really don't want that on. We're going to start off by talking about how to identify and write a research question, whatever. Okay, so you can look at it upside down. So we'll go over some of the materials that you worked through in the online materials from this past week. And then, like I said, we're going to do a bit of a skills exercise where I'm going to ask you to think about the feedback I gave you. I gave everyone pretty extensive feedback on their first homework assignment to push you forward thinking about a research question. And then we'll do another skills exercise at the end, depending on how much time we have, where we're going to look at how you can use survey data to help you work your way backward. All right. All right, so all of you did a reading about the purpose of a literature review this week. So what I wanted to ask everyone is, what's the purpose of doing a literature review? Once you've identified a topic, what were some of the different things that reading you all did said a literature review helps us do? Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things might be to help, bridge across fields. We tend to get really, really narrow and specific in the types of research that we're doing. So it can help broaden our perspective. What else though? Yeah, and this is something I do a lot that I find really helpful. Even after you've narrowed down a really concise research question, maybe you've developed a good theory, you've got hypotheses, it's always helpful to kind of get a sense for what everyone else is doing right now to try and answer these questions. So, in the past decade or so, one of the big trends that you would have seen in political science research is an increasing use of experimental methods. As opposed to observational designs to help answer questions. Other ideas? All right. Well, yeah.
They can help you refine your hypothesis for a question.
Yeah, exactly. Or they can, help you come up with some hypotheses that you might want to test. Because one of the things that we'll see when we get deeper into talking about research design is that for any good theory, we should be able to derive multiple hypotheses from that theory to test it. And usually in a research article, authors will only test, one or two of the observable implications. So that could be a potential contribution to science and to the literature if you take that theory and do an additional test that either offers support or falsification for it. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so the NOP reading that you all did said, first of all, a literature review can be an end in and of itself, right? So one of the things I noticed when I was looking at everyone's homework 1 assignment was that you weren't really formulating a research question. You had a good idea about a topic that you're interested in. And I told a lot of you, yeah, this is a really good topic. We just need to work on refining the question. But, once you've decided you're interested in something, you might want to learn more about it, right? Doing a literature review is a great place to start, because we can't be experts in everything, and that's really the only way to stay up to date on the state of the art in the discipline in a particular subject matter. And then beyond that, we can think of the literature review as actually, an action, reviewing the literature. And then Knopf points out that the other two important steps are how we integrate that literature review into the research that we're doing, right? It's going to be a component of something. So when we're starting to develop a new theory, we need to do a literature review because it's the existing scientific literature that we're going to deduce our logical arguments from, right? That's the whole idea of deductive reasoning. Likewise, this is where we see what other theories are out there, and it can help us refine those or come up with new hypotheses, right? And that's going to be incorporated into the actual research paper that we're writing. And then finally, after we've conducted this step, the literature review is going to be a section in a paper, right? So this is one of the things that all of you are going to write in your first part of the research project that you'll be turning in here in about 6 weeks or so. So be thinking about that. And I'll mention this again at the end of class today, but a literature review should never read just like a point-by-point summary of, the 10 different articles you looked at. You should be synthesizing what all of these different pieces of research are saying, deriving arguments from that. And it might seem kind of abstract, but what I always recommend people do is just read, right? Read political science articles and use those from the beginning to the end as a template for how you should be structuring your papers. That's really the best advice I can give anyone. You just, you see what it looks like by exposing yourself to it. All right, so like I said, one of the reasons we talked about doing a literature review for is that it's this preliminary step in a larger process. So it's this step that helps us go from topic to formulating a research question. What I want to do is talk a little bit about how exactly this works. How can reviewing the literature get you from topic to a good research question? And we all know what good research questions look like by now.
See how other research questions are formulated. Just reading the literature, so you can bring that over to yours.
Yeah, exactly. So at the very least, you can use it as a good template for writing a good research question. But what else might reviewing the literature help us do?
They can point out like gaps in knowledge that they found.
Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of the big reason to do it. In the research paper you're going to do in this class, I'm going to tell everyone, don't reinvent the wheel. You're mainly demonstrating skills. But if you're trying to get something published, you have to make some sort of contribution to the existing literature. You can't just replicate what someone else has already done. I mean, you can, but it's not gonna get you a good publication. It's not gonna get you very far. But yeah, it helps us identify the big questions that are still unanswered, right? So again, going back to that reading by Knopf that you all did, he points out that we can think of a literature review as a sorting process, and we can sort the articles in the books that we read into 3 categories, right? So the first question we want to ask ourselves is, what do all of these existing studies have in common, right? This is going to help you figure out what the conventional wisdom about a given topic is. And then maybe later you might want to work on refining that conventional wisdom. But that's step 1, seeing what everything has in common. The next thing you want to ask yourself, again, this comes from the process of synthesizing all of this stuff, not just doing an annotated bibliography and writing it in paragraph form. After you've identified what everything has in common, the next thing you want to start sorting into categories is, what do all of these existing studies disagree about? And if you read enough, you'll see that there's usually some consensus about a big topic, and then from there, different branches of scholars go in different directions with different types of theories. And then finally, we want to ask ourselves, what do these existing studies overlook, or what do they ignore? What's the gap in the literature? And again, I keep mentioning, use existing articles as a template for seeing what this should look like. If you look at just about any published political science article, in the conclusion, there's going to be a recap of the findings, obviously, and then they're going to explicitly tell you what they haven't looked at in this study, right? So they said, we argued this, we found support for this hypothesis. Here's what we haven't been able to answer in this study. And that's a great place to see what kinds of questions you might want to try answering. And a lot of that will come from the peer review process itself. We submit things for peer review to get them published. Usually 3 or 4 anonymous reviewers will review our work, and inevitably one of them will be like, well, I liked your paper, but what about this, this, and this? And the response back is usually, well, that's not what we're trying to do in this paper, right? That's not the topic that we're exploring, but great idea for future research. And just to satisfy that reviewer, we'll usually include, a couple sentences related to that in the conclusion. So after you've done all this, after you've reviewed things, you've sorted into one of these 3 different categories, either commonalities, disagreements, or gaps in the literature, the next thing you need to do is make a judgment call. Did you have a question? No, okay. You need to make a judgment call. So you need to decide if the disagreement in category 2 is worth exploring further. You're going to all read an article next week that makes a contribution by addressing this point of disagreement, right? It's what we call a critical test. It's used to refine theories and to see which theoretical argument has more empirical support in the real world. So that could be a good contribution. And then you want to ask yourself whether or not the gap in category 3 is worth exploring, right? Sometimes there are gaps for a reason. Some questions actually aren't all that relevant or interesting, and that might be why no one's published about it. Likewise, a topic might remain unexplored because something is really difficult to observe or to measure properly. So, depending on what your time horizon looks like, that might be something worth exploring. In a class like this, where you only have a few weeks to produce, a final research product, that's not something I would recommend that any of you take on. You want to make sure that data is available, that whatever the parts of your research question are, you can observe them, you can measure them, ideally by just downloading some data that someone else has already collected for you. In my opinion, though, it's more of a scientific contribution to address a debate rather than to try and fill a gap in existing literature. This is the whole idea of what we call normal science, right? It's incrementally building, constantly refining theories, deriving new hypotheses from existing theories to see whether or not we still have support. Like I said, maybe testing 2 competing theories against one another. The incremental approach, at least in terms of productivity, is going to get you a lot further. A lot of times in any social science discipline, addressing these big gaps is something that people will save for like way later in their career and say they have, no deadlines, 10 years to work on a book project, something like that. But the incremental normal science approach, I think, is the way that we make more of a contribution to scientific knowledge. All right, so as you're thinking about a research question, I want you to always be asking yourselves these 3 questions, right? So first of all, what's the conventional wisdom on a topic? And we'll do a little discussion activity here in a minute to see what this process looks like. So what's the conventional wisdom on a given topic? Is the conventional wisdom coming from looking at a certain time period or a certain context? If so, the theory is probably not general and could use some potential refining, right? So if we don't think that an argument's going to generalize to other contexts, like I said, we might need to tweak it, derive and test some new hypotheses. So what I want all of you to consider right now, and that we're going to talk about for a minute, is particularly when it comes to things like political engagement, political behavior, so ideology, voting, interest, all of these sorts of things, how much of what we think we know about people's political behavior or participation is based on research from the US? And I would say this is changing, but for a long time, a lot of it was. But what do all of you think, right? A lot of you have had comparative politics before and classes in American government or American politics. do we think there are some factors that might be unique to the United States that might not make this conventional wisdom or knowledge about participation here transmissible to other contexts? What do we think? What are some questions we might need to ask ourselves?
Isn't necessarily a question, but more or less like, I mean, it's definitely going to be different since this is like a more stable democracy as opposed to a lot of different developing countries around the world.
Yeah, exactly. So things we learn about political behavior in the US might be transmissible maybe to democracies in Western Europe, stable, well-established ones. But it might not tell us everything we want to know about political behavior in a country in South America, right? Where lots of things related to the political system are a little more volatile. What else?
Our demographic is so like diverse, as opposed to like a country where it only has like these native people. I feel like that plays a factor in a lot of things.
Yeah, and this is when we're talking about things like political institutions, here in the US, we think federalism is such a wonderful system, right? That does so many great things. But when you look a little more broadly, we see, well, actually, federalism might cause more problems than it helps solve if you've got either a very small country in terms of territory or population, or a relatively homogeneous population, right? So all the same ethnicity, language. It's territorial size and unique demographic makeup of the United States that makes federalism work for us. What else? Voting behavior. Let's think about that one. Absolutely, yeah. So the party system here in the United States, it's kind of unique in a comparative context. Our party system is well institutionalized. It's fairly well nationalized, and that combination we just, even in other stable old democracies, we don't always see. We have to take into account the fact that some countries have compulsory voting laws, which we don't have. We would want to take that into account if we were trying to explain political behavior elsewhere. Yeah, all of these different things are great points. So, the ones I jotted down to myself, first and foremost, again, this comes from me being a comparativist, the US has a unique set of electoral rules. Electoral rules affect everything related to accountability and representation, and therefore engagement and participation. I mentioned in the US, voting's not compulsory. It's not a holiday or a Sunday as it is in a lot of countries. So we might need to account for that if we're trying to generalize our conventional wisdom elsewhere. Party system here is different, institutionalized and nationalized. It's fairly uncommon elsewhere, particularly in new democracies or in the developing world. And then the big one, the US is a wealthy country, right? And its political institutions, such as elections, are fairly effective when we view them in a comparative context. So all of these things matter. And the conventional wisdom for a really long time here in the United States was that research consistently showed that people with more resources, particularly socioeconomic resources, are the ones who are more likely to vote. But we don't necessarily see that elsewhere. Instead, in the developing world, we still see that some resources, particularly information in that context, as opposed to time or money, these lead to increases in political engagement, political mobilization, but it only leads to an increase in voting when institutions are strong and effective. If something like elections aren't working the way that they're supposed to, if they're not competitive, if the institutions are weak, those mobilized citizens, once they get resources, they're not going to vote. They're going to go out and protest. And we wouldn't have known this if we were only looking at this relationship between resources and political engagement in the United States or in other wealthy countries. Again, we've taken two different approaches to answering the same question, and we're able to combine them into an even more general argument when we look more comparatively or try and come up with more general explanations for things. Okay, so this gets us to the first short little writing activity I would like all of us to do. And I'm not going to collect anything for a grade, but I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, I mentioned in the syllabus, all those lovely requests for rounding your grade up at the end of the semester that I will inevitably get. I'm going to weigh your participation in class, your engagement in class when making those decisions. So just to show me that you were engaged and you were here today, either in person or on Zoom, by the end of class, I want you to shoot me your written work. But in homework 1, I asked everybody to think about a research question they might want to explore in a paper. And everyone's question needed a little bit of refining, right? This was my expectation. This is why I include this exercise in the very first homework assignments of the semester. But I gave you all feedback, which hopefully you've had a chance to look at by now, about how you might refine the research question, move the project forward a little bit. Thinking back to the first thing you came up with, I want you to take a couple of minutes in class and just rewrite a research question, particularly now that you've worked through materials, exposing you to what a good research question might look like. If you decide you don't want to stick with the topic you gave me in homework 1, feel free to pick something else. You're not wedded to your research question until you actually start writing the paper. Then after we're done, I'd like some volunteers to share these with the class so that we can have a little bit of back and forth and maybe refine some of them further. All right, so we'll take 2 minutes for this part, and then I've got another part for you to think of after that. Yeah.
I cannot find the feedback.
Can no one find the feedback? No.
I saw mine.
Okay, so it's kind of tricky on Blackboard to access feedback after the fact. You have to go into the grade book and click on the name of the assignment, not the grade, and then it'll take you to a new page. There'll be a little button, I think down on the bottom right, that says like calculated score or something. You click on that, and that takes you to another page where it's got the feedback. All right, so now that you've had a chance to think on rewriting a research question for a minute, just hang on to that, and I've got a second part of the writing exercise I would like you to do. So now that you've written what's hopefully a more effective, narrow, specific research question, I want you to think about how you're going to answer it. And again, this is an instructive exercise because we're going to get midway through the semester. And even though some of you will write really excellent research designs, when it comes to actually collecting the data, you're going to run into some trouble. So I want us to start thinking about this now. And like I said, I keep harping on this. Remember, this project is about demonstrating skills. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. And really ambitious projects, they're going to get you into trouble when you've got a tight deadline. So ask yourself, what sorts of quantitative data sources are available that you could easily collect or compile in a couple of weeks? And how will these data allow you to answer whatever research question you initially posed? Okay, so like I said, just at the end of class, either give me a piece of paper with your written work if you're here in person, or shoot me your written work in an email. But let's discuss what everyone came up with first. Let's hear a research question from someone, either in the classroom or on Zoom. Yeah.
With the changing politics in Mexico affecting more of the people's interests than the unity between government and people.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that question, but yeah. How are you thinking about answering that question in terms of data?
They said it's like a 6-year term in Mexico for the last 20 years, which would be like 3 presidential cabinets.
Mm-hmm.
Look at their approval rate and compare it to when the nation was
Yeah. So that would be good. There's also lots. We'll see this here in a few minutes later on. But you can also gauge people's perceptions or evaluations of the executive before and after elections using survey data. There's a couple of big survey firms that regularly conduct representative, high quality surveys throughout all of Latin America, including Mexico. Just because of Mexico's proximity to the United States, comparative interest in it for a long time. Some of this data goes back really, really far. I think even into like the early 1990s. So potentially that might be a good way to leverage lots of variation over time if you're only going to look at one case. Yeah, excellent. What else?
I made up a simple one.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with the question.
Okay.
But I just put, what is the relationship? So I want to do something about like wealth inequality,
Mm-hmm.
but I kept thinking of really over ambitious things, so I was just trying to like make it simple.
Mhm.
But like, what's the relationship between like the highest like 1% of wealth, not like earners or anything, just wealth, the people that hold it and like their backgrounds, so what, and then like trying to figure out a way to like the odds of like making it from like that 99% of like people holding the wealth to the 1%,
Mm-hmm.
of being born into families, health, stuff like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess we'll just, we'll go back and forth and try and refine this a little bit. But as you saw in all of the materials for this week, like the best research questions to answer are simple ones that just ask a question about a relationship between two factors. So in this one, we might think of the outcome as being maybe social mobility or something like that. The ability to acquire more wealth. I don't know, some sort of outcome that we have to figure out a way to measure. But that could be what we call our dependent variable, right? There's going to be variation in that, and we want to know how variation in some other factor is affecting the outcome. Depending on the level of analysis that you're looking at, again, we could use survey data to try and get at this. There are some increasingly, we're seeing more and more of these. I just read one the other day, but it's not necessarily surveys of the top 1%, but surveys of the top maybe 5% of the wealth or income distribution, just because wealthy people don't have any interest in, doing online surveys. Like, why do we do YouGov surveys? We want gift cards, right? Like, the top 1% don't need Amazon gift cards, so they're not going to, do all of these YouGov surveys, out of the goodness of their hearts. But we're starting to see some of those. So we have some data that's out there. If it's in published work, the replication data, the survey data they use should be out there as well. You just might have to look for it.
What if my question, I'm pretty sure it's already been answered, it's just a basic question that people can research on. What if I look at research and like my exact question has already been answered? So does that mean like I just move on to a new question?
No. And like, we'll see this more when we start talking about the difference between theories and hypotheses, but
or would I have to like test a different
hypothesis? Yeah, that's what you do, and that's what we do all the time, right? So it might seem like our question has already been answered, but all of us working in a general topical field, most of us are trying to get at the same big question. But we might tweak an argument, or we might construct an argument that looks very similar to the conventional wisdom in the field, and then just derive a new observable implication from it, a new hypothesis. Because as you'll see over the next few weeks, we never, how do I say this? We never really answer research questions by 100% saying that an argument is true or false, right? That's not the goal of science. The goal of science is to see whether or not our empirical observations of the real world are more or less consistent with those arguments. So yeah, maybe just a different data source, a different way of looking at it, a slightly different hypothesis. That's all a contribution to scientific knowledge. Yep. Good. What else?
Does higher hostility lead to more severe conflict actions within dyadic militarized?
Yeah, so you've got a relationship between two concepts. The thing that you'll want to be very careful to do in your paper is just to define those concepts for a broad audience, because this is another thing that sometimes, depending on where you're trying to publish or disseminate your research, if you're trying to speak to a really general audience or publish in a broad journal, a lot of times you'll get reviewers that aren't necessarily familiar with the term, like, well, what's a mid, right? Like it's an acronym that if you study certain parts of international relations, you just kind of take for granted that everyone knows. But elsewhere in the discipline, people don't. But yeah, so long as you can clearly define those and then observe them based on whatever definition you came up with, that would be a good approach. So I remember your homework assignment. I'm reading that research question, but can you just tell the class where data for both of those different factors comes from? Because it is out there.
Yeah, there's a militarized airspace codebook that already has like pre-coded variables with the quantitative data that you can use.
Yep. So if you're interested in things like conflict, that is one potential data source. There are also a couple of data sets that scholars regularly update, like they have a whole institute just to compiling this data on civil conflict, armed civil conflict, and different ways of measuring that. So we've got data on disputes between states. We've got data on civil conflict that happens within states. There are data sets that catalog the occurrence of successful and attempted coups going back to the end of World War II. So you just have to clearly state what you're interested in, and then sometimes do a little digging. But you'll find often that the data is out there. All right, yeah. So those are all good. So the other big data source that a lot of people are interested in, usually for an independent variable, are different economic indicators. So the World Bank is a great data source. Any economic indicator you can imagine, they have data on everything from, gross domestic product per capita to things like exports as a percentage of GDP, or oil revenue as a percentage of GDP, if you're interested in studying something like the resource curse. Yeah, so like I said, it's usually out there. I don't encourage anyone to try and measure and collect things themselves unless you're going to design your own survey and field that. But I'd encourage all of you to come talk to me first if you think you have to create your own survey or do your own observations and try and measure things. Usually someone else has already done this for you. Okay. So like I said, if you're still having trouble and choosing a good research question, it's hard. It's something even a lot of people in graduate school struggle with for a few years, trying to come up with a dissertation topic. Sometimes the getting started is the hardest part. But for this project, what I'm going to recommend is, if you're still unclear about things, to work your way backward a little bit, right? So get a sense for what data is out there. You're going to look at some data, different types of data in lab assignments 2 and 3, for instance, that measure different things like political institutions, repression, conflict, people's political attitudes. And then once you see what's out there, you can figure out what an interesting question would be to ask by looking at that data. So what we're going to spend a little time doing now is thinking about how pre-existing survey data can help us formulate a research question that we can ask and answer in this, relatively short research project we're going to do here in the class. And I'm going to try and turn this on one more time, but if it's upside down, we'll manage. It's still upside down on here and not even showing on the screen. Oh well, it's fine. We don't really need it. Okay, so if you go onto Blackboard, at the very top on the left-hand side, you're going to see a link that says survey data resources. And if you click on that link, you're going to see that I've compiled a few of the big survey data sources that a lot of political scientists use in their research. So the biggie, and I got a sense from reading the first homework assignment that the vast majority of you are interested in American politics questions. This is great. We've got excellent survey data, honestly going back to the 70s, that will allow you to explore all sorts of questions. So the American National Election Study is always a good source. When I taught this class last semester, most people were using the 2016 data because the ANES consists of, it's a panel data. So we interview the same people twice. Before and after the presidential election. So by the time this assignment was being done, obviously the post-election survey data wasn't available yet. I'm not sure if it will be this semester either, but that's okay. There's plenty of good data from 2004, 8, 10, 12, like I said, going back a ways. That could be a good one. One that I'm pretty familiar with that I use a lot is data from the Latin American Public Opinion Project. This is a hugely ambitious project that tens of millions of dollars go into every time they conduct it. And starting in about 2006, 2008, some scholars at Vanderbilt University teamed up with USAID to carry out this project. And certain waves of it have data from as many as like 35 countries throughout the entire Americas. So we get every Latin American country, every Caribbean country, the United States, Canada, and all of the data is publicly available for you to use. Very high quality data. I've got a link to the World Values Survey, which might be of use to some of you. It asks questions not only about political attitudes, but also cultural ones, social ones. There's questions about religion, family values, and then the standard set of questions political scientists are usually interested in, like institutional trust, satisfaction with democracy, all of those things. So with each one of those, I've got either a link to a code book or a link to a page that has code books. Code books are it's where they list the questions and then they tell you what the numbers in the survey correspond to. So start looking at those and see if you can identify two questions that represent two different factors that you think might be related. And that's a good way to start thinking about a research question. So if you go back and review the video after class, you'll see in the slides I say, before you ever download any data, always read through the code book and the questionnaire. You want to know what population was sampled. We'll see more what this means here in a few weeks, but to make the most valid causal inferences to a general population, we need to make sure that our sample is representative of that population. You'll see that in certain surveys like the American National Election Study, certain minority groups are oversampled so that political scientists can have statistical leverage if they want to do subsample analysis. You'll want to ask yourself whether or not certain groups are underrepresented. And this is one of the pitfalls of any survey research approach. Just think about it. We're conducting surveys, particularly online ones. What sorts of groups within the population might be hard to reach? Elderly, yeah. What else? Yeah. So this is something we want to think really carefully about if we're using survey data, especially from a developing country, right? There might be good internet access, computer access in the capital city, but out in rural parts of the country, this might not be the case. When we talk about the census, we see that it's really hard to sample and survey people that don't have homes at all, right? So homeless populations are consistently underrepresented in survey data. Just something to always think about. And then looking at the code book will help you, like I said, it'll help you figure out what the variables are going to be that make up your research question. Variables are, we've got an independent variable, which causes something to happen, a dependent variable, which is affected by the independent. It's the outcome we're trying to explain. Which questions can you use for each of those? And then oftentimes when you download the data, it's just going to be an Excel sheet with a bunch of numbers in it. But if you just look at it, it has no meaning whatsoever. You have to read the code book because the same exact question could be coded 2 different ways, right? So if we've got the question, how would you rate the president's handling of the economy? We could have a 1 to 5 scale that goes from very well to very poor with neutral in the middle. Or it might be coded such that it goes from very poor to very well. And if you make the mistake of not paying attention to that, obviously your statistical output is going to tell you something that's probably not consistent with what your expectations were. In this sort of reverse coding, it happens all the time. You just have to be mindful of it and really careful. Okay, so what I've got on the screen are just a few screenshots from the American National Election Study Codebook in 2016. Like I said, again, you can go back and review this if you want to, or just look at it yourself. It's up there for you to see. And I've got a few different questions. And what I want us to do is think how we might formulate a research question just based on, these 6 questions that I've got on the screen. So I've got a question about a person's political ideology that asks them to indicate on a scale from 1 being extremely liberal to 7 being extremely conservative, where would you place yourself? So that's 1. And then there's a question that asks, how interested are you in following political campaigns? Are you very interested, somewhat interested, or not very interested? We've got a question that asks, should the federal government make it more difficult to buy a gun? And again, you can say more difficult, easier, or keep it the same. And we'll just do 1 more of these. The question about the state of the economy. Would you say that over the past 12 months, the state of the economy in the United States has got 5 options that go from gotten much better, 3 stayed about the same, and 5's gotten much worse. So just based on those, what's a research question that we might be able to ask and answer with this data?
And look at how right-leaning they are, the independent variable, and then use that to with the rest of the questions and kind of follow trends to see based on political preference how likely it is, not like the state of the economy or one gun control or stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. So we would ask, just in good research question language, what's the relationship between political ideology and support for stricter gun controls? Or what's the relationship between a person's political ideology and their perceptions of the state of the economy? And from having looked at this data many times, and from conventional wisdom, we can probably figure out the answer to both of these questions, but we want to empirically verify it. We're going to see that people who place themselves on that more conservative end of the ideological spectrum based on this survey question are probably going to be less in favor of stricter gun laws. And the question about the relationship between ideology and perceptions of the economy, well, surprise, surprise, context matters. It depends on who's in control of the government right now. So during times when there is democratic control of government, we tend to see rosier perceptions of the economy among liberals, whereas when Republicans are in control of the government, particularly the White House, the executive, we tend to see the opposite, right? Liberals say the economy is doing worse. Conservatives say it's doing that it's doing better. Yeah, so that's what I mean by this, right? So like a lot of you said you were interested in understanding how something affects something related to voting. Well, as you look through this code book, you're going to see that there are tons of questions that we can use to measure political engagement in all sorts of different ways, everything from how much political news you consume, where you get that news, whether or not you intend to vote or actually did vote. There's a question about that in the post-election survey. How often do you talk about politics? All sorts of things that we can use. And each time you look at a different relationship, it's a different empirical test of what we might think would be an answer that, you know, political scientists have already come up with. Yeah, so, and then the other thing I had in here was just a screenshot of the code book from the Latin American Public Opinion Project, which likewise, it looks a little different in the way that it's laid out, but it tells you all the same information, the same important information. So what I wanted to show everyone was we have these questions about people's perceptions of crime and violence in their neighborhood. This is a really salient issue in a lot of Latin American countries, particularly in urban areas. So in the most recent survey, they asked everyone, how many times have you been a victim of a crime in the last 12 months? And you know, they can indicate a number. It gives you some sort of quantitative indicator of people's perceptions of criminal violence in their neighborhood. Likewise, they asked people if there have been any murders in their neighborhood in the last 12 months. Do you own a firearm for protection? These are all kind of, in a different way, getting at the same concept, right? People's either fear or their perceptions of violence. And then there's like 21 different questions about support for all different sorts of political institutions, everything from the police and the army to the president, Congress, political parties, all sorts of stuff. So as you can imagine, based on that, there are multiple different ways that we might answer the question, well, what's the relationship between perceiving a high level of violence in your neighborhood and support for political institutions? You know, potentially 20 different ways of looking at the same country. And by looking at this survey data, seeing what kind of questions we have available to us, we can work our way backward toward that more general research question, come up with some hypotheses, and then test it with the data that is available to us. Okay, so like I said, have a look at Blackboard. In addition to the two studies we've talked about, there's another data source from Latin America, also free for you to use and download. It's called the Latino Barometer. It goes back a little further in time, but the data quality is not quite as great, and they don't always ask consistent questions from one survey wave to the next, but it's there for you to use. I mentioned the World Values Survey. There's an equivalent of the Latino Barometer. It's carried out in the Arab world called the Arab Barometer. There's an Afro Barometer that's now got 5 waves, covers close to 40 African countries. The European Social Survey, so on and so forth. There's tons of this data out there. You just need to look at it. So start looking at the code books now. And what you'll ultimately need to do toward the end of the semester is, if you want to use this data, you'll have to come to me, tell me what variables you want, and then I'll have to get them for you in an Excel format that you can actually use. But I have a lot of this data already, so as long as you know what variables and questions you want, it's pretty easy for me to get it to you. All right, so that is everything I wanted to cover today. Over the next week, continue trying to narrow down a research question, take the advice I gave you, start looking for data and working your way backward toward a more specific research question that asks about a relationship between 2 different political factors. And then remember that for your research paper, which isn't due for a few weeks, you'll need to cite at least 10 scholarly sources. You know what scholarly sources entail now. You all did a homework about it. These are academic, peer-reviewed books and journals, not newspaper stories, not blog entries, peer-reviewed stuff. And revisit the lesson on the literature review and start looking at other published political science research to see how you should be structuring the lit review in your paper. Come to office hours if you have any trouble thinking of a more refined research question. And then remember, lab assignment 1 is due next week. This is the one lab I'm not going to do the in-person help session for, because all you're doing is writing citations. As long as you can follow directions and replicate a citation from that style guide I had you look at, you'll do just fine. All right, I will see everybody next Friday, if not before. And apologies for the in-room technology issues this morning.